So, how do different philosophical schools define happiness? And frankly, what makes the word so complex?
Those are very good questions. Well, let's start with the happiness bit. Different philosophies define happiness differently, and in fact, arguably one of the things that differentiates different schools of philosophy is precisely how they cash out the concept of happiness. And look, there is also quite a bit of confusion among people. If you know, social psychologists have done research on happiness, and it turns out that people tend to think of happiness in different ways. For instance, at a very minimum, sometimes happiness is the feeling in the moment that you are experiencing, like I'm happy to see you, or I'm happy to be having a good meal or whatever. But then there is also the long term prospect of happiness, right? So I'm happy that my life is going well. I'm happy that I have, that I'm loved by my partner, that sort of stuff, right? Or I'm happy about my career. So at the very least, there are those two components. Philosophers, of course, make things a little bit more complicated because they tend to think a little bit more carefully than your average person about things. So there are fairly major differences between different schools in terms of what they suggest ultimately human happiness consists of. So let's take two, for example. Let's compare among the ancient Greco-Roman schools. If you compare Stoicism and Epicureanism, for instance, for the Epicureans, happiness is really a life of tranquility, of serenity. The term in Greek is ataraxia, which literally translates as serenity. And how do you achieve that? Well, you achieve that if you try to stay away as much as possible from pain, both mental pain and physical pain, but especially mental pain. So basically, the goal for an Epicurean is ataraxia, tranquility, and how you get there, the path to that goal is stay away as much as possible from pain, which does have practical implications. For instance, the Epicureans typically say that we should stay away as much as possible from politics, because politics brings pain, as we all know. So an Epicurean life tends to be a life when you stay, when you're a small little group of friends and you try to enjoy the small pleasures of life. But not only you don't get involved in politics, you also don't go after a lot of things that most people might think worthwhile. For instance, fame. Right, fame is not worth it for an Epicurean because it creates more headaches than anything else, and so on and so forth. So that's the Epicurean view. By contrast, the Stoic view is that ultimately what we want is, as they put it, to live according to nature, meaning that we want to do what comes natural to a human being as a species, as an animal, and they claim that what comes natural to us is to use our reason, our ability to think, because that's one of the major characteristics of our species, and to live pro-socially. That is, to cooperate with other people, try to live well with other people. Why? Because, again, we are fundamentally a social species, right? So the goal for the Stoics is to live according to human nature in that sense that I just said. And how do you get there? Well, you get there by practicing what they call the virtues. So by trying to be wise and courageous and just and temperate, that kind of stuff. Why those virtues? Because those tend to be pro-social. They are reasonable and pro-social. They are applications of the two fundamental sort of tenets of Stoicism. You can also expand this kind of discussion outside of the Western tradition and say, what about Buddhism, for instance? Same idea. For the Buddhists, the major problem in life is suffering. And that suffering is caused by our ego's attachment to things. And, so we want too much stuff. We want too many things. We want. And so the antidote to that, therefore, is to live a life of largely detachment from things. To some extent, even people, because people create a similar problem with attachment if you're too attached to somebody, but certainly things. So it's definitely a sort of what we would say an anti-consumerist kind of philosophy, right? So there too, the goal is to decrease suffering, and the way you do that or one way you do that is by working to deflate your ego, basically, to what they call your rapacious ego, and so on and so forth. So we could go on for quite a bit, so exploring the differences between different philosophies. But basically, what they all have in common is that they assume that there is one or more fundamental goals, whether it is tranquility of mind, lack of suffering, or living pro-socially. And then there are ways in which you get to that goal, right? Avoidance of pain, fighting your rapacious ego, practicing the virtues, etc. So it's pretty much a standard kind of approach that cuts across philosophies. One more thing about this question, which is today we also have empirical evidence about what does and does not make human beings happy, right? Because social psychologists have done research on this thing. Harvard University, for instance, has had a long-term, decades-long research program that looks at thousands of people. They follow them throughout their lives, and they keep track of how what happens to them and how they respond to what happens. And the major generalization that comes out of that study, I'm simplifying quite a bit, but the major generalization comes out of that study is that there are essentially two things that make people happy. The fundamental one is meaningful activities. And meaning usually comes out of social relations. So in that sense, the Stoics were kind of right. We need to act pro-socially. We tend to be happy when we do things that involve other people in a positive fashion. Okay. And that could be all sorts of things. Your career could be pro-social, your relations outside of your job, there's also your family, your friends, etc. And then there is a little bit of a spice that you need to add on top of that, and that's a little bit of pleasure, right? A life where you develop, you pursue meaningful projects, but there is no pleasure. It's a little bit of a hard life. And so the Epicureans, in some sense, were right. You need a little bit of pleasure. That was a hedonistic philosophy, but pleasure is not going to be the fundamental aspect of your life. It's kind of mostly about developing good relationships with other people, and then there's this little spice that you put on it, and that's the pleasure. Now, you also asked a second question. What was the second question?
Yeah, I wanted to again kind of ask, and it's a more meta question, which is why this focus on happiness? Before I'd asked what makes the word happiness so complex, I think we kind of answered that question in full. Right. But why this obsession with happiness among other things? Not pleasure, not the avoidance of pain, not love, not satisfaction, but happiness. What is the point?
Well, that's a good question. And I think the best way that I know it has been answered is by Aristotle, actually. In a book called The Nicomachean Ethics, he asks exactly that question, why happiness? And then he says, well, look, of all the goods that we go after, all of the goods that we go after can be divided into two major categories. There are some goods that are instrumental. That is, you pursue them because they're good for something else. For instance, right, if I say, well, why would you want to have a good career? Well, typically there's an answer to that, which doesn't refer directly to the career. It says, you would say things like, well, I need to make money. For instance, I want to have, and I can ask you, well, why do you need to get money? And then you say, because I want a nice house. And why do you need a nice house? Well, because I want to have a family. Well, why do you want to have a family? And at some point, you'll stop and say, well, because that's what makes me happy. Right? When you get to the point where it doesn't make any sense to ask, well, why do you want to be happy, for instance, then Aristotle says, well, then you reached a ultimate intrinsic good, right? So there are instrumental goods that you pursue because they are bringing you something else. And then there are intrinsic goods, which are good in and of themselves. And according to Aristotle, happiness is that good. It's that kind of good. It's intrinsic. That is, while it makes sense for you to ask, why would you want to make money? Because some people get along in life with little money. It makes sense for you to ask, why do you want to get married? Because some people get in life without getting married. It makes perfect sense for you to ask, why do you want to have children? Because some people go without children. But it doesn't make a lot of sense to ask, well, why do you want to be happy? Because everybody wants to be happy. It's the kind of ultimate goal. Of course, as we just said a few minutes ago, then the thing becomes complicated because people, it turns out, mean different things by that word. And that's when we need to sort of start reflecting, okay, what do you mean by happiness? And does it make sense to pursue happiness in this sense as opposed to this other sense? But so the answer to the question, I think, is, why is everybody obsessed with happiness? Well, because that's an intrinsic good. It's the kind of good that it's the ultimate thing. Nobody wants to be unhappy. It's just not a thing for
Sure.
humans.
Well, some people are masochistic, no?
Sure, but we tend to think of those as a little bit out of the norm in terms of their it's a pathological condition.
Sure.
Want to be masochistic. Also, even the masochist would say, well, that's what makes me happy.
Huh. Interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
So they're a little pathological because what makes them happy is something that most human beings will stay away from, pain, right? But still, even to a masochist, if you say, okay, and why are you doing that? Probably the answer, I'm guessing, I don't know many masochists, but
Likewise.
the answer probably is going to be, well, because that makes me happy.
Yeah. I do want to kind of come back to the present and maybe put you on the spot a little bit and ask,
Sure.
what do you think the definition or school of thought in terms of happiness is in modern day? We talked about happiness in terms of the Stoics and the Epicureans, but what do you think happiness is right now? Has happiness changed or evolved from the ancient world to now?
Yes and no. So I think that to a large extent, many of the ancient conceptions of happiness, both in the Eastern and Western traditions, they're still with us. A lot of people practice Buddhism today, for instance. So a lot of people seem to be convinced that the problem with your human life is, in fact, too much suffering. Many people practice different religions, and so that means that they think that happiness consists in being in synchrony with whatever God they believe in and whatever religious precepts they want to follow. There are people who practice Stoicism. There are not many Epicureans these days, but there are a lot of people who are hedonists. They go out, they go for pleasure. So that's not really very different. So to some extent, most of the early answers to that question are still around, and lots of people still essentially use them. However, there are also novel ways to be happy, like to some extent, I guess. So in modern Western societies, for instance, especially in the United States, there is an emphasis on two things: fame and money.
Mm-hmm.
Right? A lot of people want to be famous. A lot of people want to be, celebrity or a YouTube influencer or whatever it is, right? And of course, the two go together. They also want to make money, right? Because being a celebrity typically means you're actually making money. But even though, and so you could say, well, that's more modern. That's clearly a capitalistic sort of 21st century kind of approach. But frankly, if you were to talk to a Stoic or a Buddhist from 2,000 years ago, they will say, yeah, I know people like that. Even in my times, there were lots of people who are going after fame and glory and money and sort of stuff. And we think they're misguided. We think that ultimately they're not going to be actually happy. They think they're going to be happy with that kind of stuff, but they're not. So I don't think there is, in modern times, anything that is drastically innovative about happiness. Even research like the Harvard study that I mentioned earlier essentially confirms what Aristotle would not have been surprised by the results of the Harvard study. Would say, yeah, of course, it has to do with a modicum of pleasure, and mostly has to do with good relationships with other people. So, yeah, I don't think there is much new under the sun. The specifics are different, right? So obviously, 2,000 years ago, nobody would have wanted to be an influencer because there was no such a thing. But there were similar, analogous ways to become famous. And so what we've invented, I think, are specific ways of of going after money, fame, et cetera, but not the concept of money and fame. Those have been around for a long time, which is frankly one of the reasons, a major reason, why I'm so interested in ancient philosophy. People rightly ask the questions like, why should we listen to what people said, 2,000 years ago or 2,500 years ago? And the answer is, it depends on what it is that you're interested in. Let's say that you were interested in pursuing modern biology or physics, then I would definitely say don't read Aristotle. Don't waste your time with Aristotle, because what Aristotle wrote about physics or biology is not up to speed. Right? It's way out of fashion. It's interesting what he wrote about those fields. It's interesting in terms of history of ideas, but it's not. You're not going to become a biologist or a physicist. On the other hand, if you're interested in what makes people tick and what makes people happy or not happy, if you're interested in how to live a good life as a human being, yeah, then actually what those people had intuitions about 2 millennia ago, pretty much that still stands. In the meantime, we have refined those intuitions. We now have empirical quantitative data, and so they're not just intuitions anymore. The ancient Greco-Romans or the ancient Buddhists were looking at people. They formed their ideas by looking at people's behaviors and and reasoning about what they were observing, right? So it was based on observations. Nowadays, it's based on controlled experiments. You can do, long-term experiments. You can do large samples. You can do statistical analysis, and the results are certainly more precise, but they're not really that different qualitatively. They're pretty much where modern social psychologists are pretty much telling us the same things that the Stoics or the Buddhists have been telling us for over 2,000 years.
I do want to turn back to the money and fame argument,
Yeah.
because especially people from my generation, I'm 23, and people from my generation are really obsessed with that. Especially
Yeah.
money, but for a certain reason. It's not just that they're seeing it on social media and stuff, but like they don't have any money, and
Mm-hmm.
so they need the money to buy a house, start a family, all of these things. But let's set that
Sure.
aside. The people that really care about money and fame would kind of retort to you. They'd listen to what you're saying, and it would go through one ear and out the other for most of them. And they'd retort to you and say, yeah, but money and fame would make me happy. Like once I
Right.
have those things, I would be happy. So those are intrinsic to me.
Right.
How do we get them to understand that these are really instrumental things? Like it's
Yeah.
turtles all the way down in a certain way.
Yeah. Well, one answer, of course, would be just wait another 20 years and then we'll talk.
Mm.
Right. So, I mean, a lot of people when they are young, of course, they have, by definition, not through their fault, but by definition, they have not a lot of experience in life, and so it's pretty natural for a lot of people to say, oh, but all I need is material goods, money, fame, houses, and so on and so forth. That's pretty straightforward. But then your life continues, and you have experiences, and you fall in love, and you have children, maybe, or something like that, and then you start seeing that actually other things are far more important. Now, and they contribute more to your happiness. Now, that said, nobody's arguing that money and a good reputation. I don't know about fame, but certainly a good reputation are not actually important components of a good life, right? Certainly, you want to have money to, at the very least, meet your basic requirements, right? You want to have food on your table for you and your family. You want to have a shelter for when you go at night, and of course, beyond those needs, you also want to have a little bit of expendable income. You want to travel, perhaps, or you want to pursue your projects. You want to have a little vacation, et cetera, et cetera. So nobody's denying, not even the Stoics would deny that those things are part of a normal human life. It's just that by themselves, they won't make you happy. That is, think about it this way: if you had all the money in the world and all the riches in the world and all the as large a house as you want, et cetera, but the condition for that would be, and you're going to enjoy on your own on a deserted island, right? No contact with anybody else. I'm pretty sure most people would not take that bargain. Even at 23, you'd say, "Wait a minute, hold on. There is a catch here. This is not something that I want." Which tells you right there that evidently money may be necessary, but certainly not sufficient for your happiness. It's not enough. There has to be something else, and that something else has to do with relationships. Now, fame, it's an interesting issue because why would you want to be famous? Now, again, fame is an instrumental good. It's not an ultimate good. Nobody wants to be famous for the sake of being famous. You want to be famous for other reasons. Okay, one of those reasons might be money. So we already talked about money. It's, you're going to be wealthy and fine. Another reason might be because you want to influence people. You want to, make your mark by influencing people. At that point, I would say, well, there's nothing wrong with that, so long as you're doing it in a way that it will actually make you feel good about it. That is, for instance, if you become famous by selling crap to people, right? Things that they don't need, or that they make their life worse.
Most TikTok influencers. That's how I go.
Right. Are you really positive that that's going to make you feeling good?
Yeah.
When you get to the end of your life and you look back and say, you know what I did in my life? I ruined a lot of people's lives in order to make money. I don't know. I want to think that that's not going to make a lot of people very happy. They might in the process, especially again when they are young and sort of not wise, they might think that oh, who cares? Those are suckers, and what's important is what I do. But eventually, I want to hope that at the bottom line, everybody has a conscience. And so, little by little, that kind of stuff starts bothering you. So the problem isn't necessarily with fame. The Stoics, for instance, said that, if there's nothing wrong with fame. Fame is just, it's actually neutral. It's neither good nor bad. It depends on what you do with it, right? So if you use your fame in order to do good in the world, that's great. Then that's a great thing. Good for you. But if you use your fame or your wealth or anything else you have in order to make people miserable or to exploit people or something like that, then I think that's not going to make you happy. Yeah. But of course, ultimately that is an empirical question, not a philosophical one. And as I said before, the empirical evidence seems to be that people do want when they get to the end of their lives. There's a lot of research in psychology about end of life sort of situations. So psychologists go into hospices and retirement homes and stuff like that, and start interviewing people, and they ask them, so what make you, when you look back, what makes you feel good and what makes you feel bad about stuff? And a lot of people, turns out, do have a conscience. A lot of people say that what makes them feel good is to have built good relationships with their friends, their family, their co-workers, and so on and so forth, or to have done something that is useful for other people. Not a lot of people seem to get to the end of their lives and say, well, that's because I made one more cent by exploiting others. That's surely there are, human beings are complicated enough that surely you will find exceptions. You will find the psychopath who says, oh yeah, I'm very happy about the fact that but those are psychopaths, and that's a pathology, right? It's not something, I don't think of many children who want to grow up and say, yeah, I want to be a psychopath one of these days. It's like, no, you don't. So what I would say to young people, let me step back for a second. When I write my books, and these days, most of my books are about sort of moral philosophy, ethics, and how to live your life and that sort of stuff. I tend to write as if I were addressing myself 10 or 20 years earlier, right? When I did not know this kind of stuff. And so what I would suggest is, well, if you really think that fame and money are all there is to life, you might want to read. You might want to talk to people, especially older people, including your family members, including people that you know directly. Sample around, see how others respond to that kind of stuff. Because the thing is, if we take a direction in life that will likely turn out not to be a particularly good one, there is a risk of wasting like a decade or two or three of your life, and then realize that like, you know what, that wasn't actually that good. I thought it was good, but it wasn't that good. So perhaps before you commit to a particular path, explore things. Read a bit about why is it that Buddhists don't seem to be concerned, for instance, with either wealth or fame. Maybe they have a point. Or why is it that not only Stoics or something, but even Christians, for instance, one of the basic teachings of Christianity is that wealth is not important, which is not, again, not to say that you do not need some material goods. Of course you do. You're a physical being, so you will need in your life a certain amount of material goods. There's no question about it. But is that really the ultimate goal? If you think so and that makes you happy, whatever, fine. But it might not. And so it'll be wise to consider at least some of the alternatives and ask yourself, why is it that so many people don't think that what my priorities are actually that good? There may be a reason for it.
Yeah, in terms of fame, I would encourage people to, as you said, read about famous people, read about people who have money, and even talk to people who have both. If you can't talk to those people, it's much easier than you think, but if you can't talk to those people, you can read articles like Tim Ferriss has, 11 Reasons Not to Become Famous, which is a fantastic article. These things, we have these kind of preconceptions because of social media. Again, we only see the good sides of these things. We see the Lamborghinis, private jets, Instagram models, all of these things. We don't see the darker sides of these things. And so when you
we don't
realize
see the depression, we don't see
Yep.
the broken marriages, we don't see the broken friendships, we don't see also the stress, frankly. Right? Because the problem is, once, if you want to become famous and rich and famous, as they say, that comes with a lot of stress. Because you have to constantly keep working at certain things, constantly defending your turf, because it's very easy to become famous and then to go down into obscurity. And so if you want to keep it, it's constantly stressful. You open yourself to a lot of envy and enmity from other people. If you're rich and famous, and let's say somebody falls in love with you, how would you know that that person is falling in love with you, or is falling in love with your fame and your money? And it doesn't, trust me, it doesn't feel good when you cannot trust the person that is your partner, let's say, or your friends even, because you never know. You always have this thing in the back of your mind. It's like, well, maybe they don't actually love me. They love my bank account or my fame.
my
So
friend group,
yeah,
the hypervigilance goes into overdrive. Do they love me or do
exactly,
they love what I have?
exactly.
That's yeah, I've experimented with that, and I have been young and cared about those things, but luckily I was in, not luckily, but I happened to live in a time of being in COVID, and I was reading a lot
Yeah,
of ancient philosophy. I went to school for philosophy, and yeah, these ideas and these kinds of ways of thinking resonated with me truly. So getting
yeah,
back to those, eudaimonia,
yeah.
what does that mean? And why is it maybe a more accurate term for describing a fulfilling life than
Yeah.
happiness is?
Yeah, eudaimonia or eudaimonia is how the ancient Greeks referred to to what we translate as happiness, right? But you're right that even modern psychologists, especially so-called positive psychologists are people who are interested in using psychology to improve human life, not just to deal with pathologies, right? So standard psychology, it is about pathologies. You go to the psychotherapist because there's something wrong. But then a few decades ago, psychologists started thinking, wait a minute, but there's also a positive side of that, right? It's like going to the doctor. It used to be that you go to the doctor only if you're sick. To fix something, but these days you practice a lot of preventive medicine. So you go to the doctor so that the doctor is going to help you to live a healthy life, so that you don't get as sick as it used to be. So similarly for psychology, a positive psychologist is somebody who's interested in helping people live a good life, not just fixing the problems. And positive psychologists, of course, immediately got interested in happiness. But because of the problems that I was mentioning a few minutes ago, that people mean too many different things by happiness, and it's not clear really. Every time that somebody says, "Oh, I want to be happy," that it's not really clear what exactly they mean. At some point, positive psychologists stumbled under the word eudaimonia, which translates best, I think, as the life worth living. And so if you put it that way, then yeah, everybody wants to live a life worth living, right? You don't want to waste your life. Nobody wants to waste their lives. So then, of course, the question is, well, what makes a life worth living? And again, now we're back to the issue of different philosophies giving different answers. But the question is also empirical, because as a psychologist, you can investigate it, data in hand. But so that's why the word eudaimonia is used more often these days, especially in psychology and certainly in philosophy, because it has that kind of broad meaning, broad translation, the life worth living, that we all agree. It's like, yeah, we definitely want to do that. And now let's try to figure out what that, how do you actually implement that? What kind of choices you're going to make in that respect. So I think that's why eudaimonia is become a rather popular term. Of course, it's a ancient Greek term, so a lot of people are still not familiar with it. I bet that if you go to your friends and say, I want to be eudaimon, they're going to look at you and say, what? You're going to be what? But that's not a problem. That can become a point of conversation, right? It's like, oh, well, let me explain to you. It just means that I want to live a life worth living, and at that point, probably the light bulb goes off and says, oh, okay, I get what you're meaning there. And we don't have a single word in English for that. Right? We have meaningful life or life worth meaning, worth living, but we don't have a single word. So the idea is that you translate an entire sentence basically with just one word, and that becomes the reference from in terms of thinking and talking about it.
How did you get involved in this type of work? Were you obsessed with ancient philosophy from day one, or was it like a road to Damascus experience or a gradual thing?
It was a little bit of a road to Damascus thing, but so my background is actually as a scientist. I am a biologist, and my initial career in academia was as an evolutionary biologist. But then, of course, as we were saying a few minutes ago, what happens often is that you reach a point where you run into a little bit of a crisis. When I was in my early 40s, a number of things happened simultaneously about the same year. I was hit by a divorce that I was not expecting, so it kind of came out of nowhere. My father died a few months later. There was a major shift in my career. I changed job, moved across the country. And now, any psychologist will tell you that one of those things is pretty stressful. If 3 or 4 of them happen within a span of a few months, you're like, whoa, what the heck is going on here, right? So that was my moment of pause, basically. I said, okay, hold on here. I need to figure out how to deal with these things. Because up to that point, my life had been pretty smooth. I knew what I wanted to do. I had chosen my career fairly early on. My studies had gone for fine. I got a job almost immediately. So it's like, things were good. I got married, etc. And I had a child. And so the standard sort of life trajectory, nothing bad really had happened up to that point. And then all of a sudden it's like, whoa. So I thought, okay, maybe I need to pause. And I took especially the time. So when you in academia, when you change jobs, the way it usually happens is that you finish a semester, the spring semester, let's say in May, at your previous job, and then you start your next job the following fall, September. So that means you have the whole summer where you're basically on your own, and you can take a break and say, okay, what do I want to do? So I took that summer to start looking around in terms of, okay, what sort of resources can I find that might be helpful in order to cope with the kind of situation that I'm dealing with. And so I realized that certainly I want to read some psychology, social psychology, but I also want to read some philosophy, some ethics, because probably there's probably good ideas in there. And so I started with Buddhism, actually, because several of my friends told me, people that run into these kind of problems often find the Buddhism, especially in terms of the practice of Buddhism, meditation, stuff like that. But even the basic ideas, the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path to Enlightenment, that sort of stuff. And so I started studying Buddhism, and it was interesting, but it really didn't click for some reason. Possibly cultural reasons. I didn't grow up reading that kind of literature with that kind of language, possibly because Buddhism has a type of metaphysics that doesn't really go very well with my training as a scientist. So I had a little bit of trouble. It's like, nah, I don't know about this. Sounds interesting, but. And then I realized pretty quickly that actually probably a better answer that fit my needs was going to come from the Greco-Roman tradition. One of the advantages was that I was already familiar with it. I grew up in Italy, and I did read the classics, stuff like that. So it's like, okay, well, these were people who I kind of knew, right? Seneca, who was a Stoic philosopher, Marcus Aurelius, etc. These are people that I either have actually read when I was younger, or at least I've heard of, right? And so I decided to study Stoicism in particular more seriously. And one of the very few, and this is the road to Damascus kind of thing. So it just happened that the very first Stoic that I read during that period was a guy named Epictetus. And Epictetus studied his life as a slave back in first century Rome, and eventually was freed, and he was given the opportunity. He was a bright guy. He was given the opportunity to study philosophy. He eventually became a teacher. He founded his own school. And we have some of his writings. He actually didn't write anything personally, but we have one of his students who took down a lot of the things that Epictetus was saying. And so I started reading Epictetus, and that was like, I heard the click at the back of my mind. It's like, wait a minute, this guy makes a lot of sense. He's a no-nonsense kind of person. He tells you things very clearly, very bluntly. He uses an interesting sort of sense of humor that borders on sarcasm, and I kind of respond to that. I like that way of interacting. So I got immediately into Epictetus, and that got me, therefore, into Stoicism. And here we are. We're still talking about it.
How have you incorporated these understandings into your own life? You talked about these moments of stress and kind of an aggregation, but how did you use those teachings in order to overcome them? Obviously, I'm not asking you the personal details of it, but I guess what framework did you use?
So I found one of the reasons I found Stoicism in particular to be very useful is because it is a very practical philosophy. In fact, it's so practical that back in the 1960s, a number of American psychologists started out this new movement called cognitive behavioral therapy. Mm-hmm. And cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, in the meantime has become the most popular and evidence-based type of psychotherapy. In other words, it works. Well, they started it from an inspiration from the Stoics, especially Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius. Why? Because the Stoics actually had a number of techniques. They developed a number of practical tricks, basically, life hacks, as we would call them today, in order to deal with stressful or challenging situations, to deal with setbacks and stuff like that. And frankly, to deal with life in general. It's not just about the setbacks. Also, when your life is going well, you still have to deal with it, meaning that you have to navigate it in the best way possible. So just to give you an example, I mean, there are lots of these techniques, and I actually been in a book with a friend of mine a few years ago called A Handbook for New Stoics, where we go systematically through dozens and dozens of exercises, which are all called from the Stoic literature. So there's a lot of them. But to give you a practical example, one of the things that really made immediately a difference in my life is a notion that comes from Epictetus, and that he calls the fundamental rule. And right there, the term tells you that he thinks it's important. It's a fundamental rule, right? It's not a minor little thing. It's important. Epictetus talks about this rule, excuse me, right at the beginning of one of the two books that are attributed to him, the Enchiridion, which is the manual, means the manual. It's a short little book. And unfortunately, a lot of people make the mistake of starting their Stoicism there without, because, it's short. Like it's really 53 paragraphs. So you can read it in an afternoon. It's easy to read. It's not easy to understand because it's not meant as an introduction to Stoicism. It's actually meant for advanced students, as a kind of a recap for advanced students. So I wouldn't suggest people to start with the Enchiridion. Nevertheless, the Enchiridion itself begins with this famous phrase. It says, where Epictetus says, some things are up to us, other things are not up to us. And a good life is the result of focusing on the things that are up to us and developing an attitude of acceptance and equanimity toward the things that are not up to us. This notion is actually found in other cultures, in other traditions. You find it also in Buddhism, for instance, and you find it in modern Christianity. If you might have heard of something called the Serenity Prayer, which is a modern Christian prayer. It was written by an American theologian at the beginning of the 20th century. And it's used at the beginning of 12-step meetings of 12-step organizations like Alcoholics Anonymous, right? And the Serenity Prayer basically asks God to give us the wisdom to tell the difference between what we can change and what we cannot change, the courage to change what we can, and the serenity to accept what we cannot. That's basically Epictetus. It's rephrased of Epictetus, but it's essentially the same idea. Okay, well, that sounds pretty straightforward and commonsensical, right? So yeah, some things are up to me, meaning that I am responsible for them. I can act on them. Other things are not up to me, meaning that there is not much I can do about them. And yeah, it makes perfect sense to say you should focus where your agency is efficacious, where you can actually do stuff and then accept the rest as it comes. But then it gets tricky once Epictetus gets down to telling you what things are up to you and what things are not up to you. That becomes counterintuitive, right? So he says that basically there are only three things that are up to you. Your judgments about things. So whether whatever you think of a certain thing, your decisions to act or not to act, and your values, whether you think that something is good or not good, right? That's it. He says those are the only things that are up to you. The rest, which includes your health, your wealth, your reputation, your career, your relationships, and all that sort of stuff, he says they're not up to you. Now, you think about it for a moment, you say, wait a minute, hold on a second here. What do you mean my health is not up to me, right? I can do things about my health. I can go to the gym or exercise. I can eat a healthy diet. I can go to the doctor on a regular basis. That's all up to me. But Epictetus will say, yes, those are all judgments and decisions to act. So they are up to you. But the outcome of those decisions are not up to you. You can do everything right. Good diet, preventative medicine, exercise, et cetera, and then a tiny little virus kills you. Right? Not under your control, not up to you. Or you can do everything right, and then you cross the street and a car runs you over and you're dead, or you go to the hospital. So the general notion here is that what is really up to us are our intentions to do certain things, right? And beginning those actions, putting forward those actions, but not the outcomes. And so what basically Epictetus is saying, which I found extremely useful on a day-to-day basis, is, okay, so focus on your judgments, try to arrive at your best judgments, try to arrive at your best decisions about what to do or not to do about certain things. And then prepare yourself for the notion that sometimes things are going to work out your way and sometimes they're not. So let me give you a couple of very basic, straightforward examples. I travel a lot. So it happens fairly often that I get to the airport and the flight is canceled or postponed by several hours. Well, it comes natural to people to get upset, to get angry, to start yelling at the poor airline person behind the counter who has absolutely no fault because they want you to get out of the hell of there as much as you want to get out of there. But it's, but they happen to be back there. So lots of people get upset, get angry, their day is ruined, and they start worrying about, well, if I miss my flight, then I'm gonna miss the connection, or I'm gonna be delayed. My vacation is gonna be problem, blah blah blah. So I repeatedly say, don't worry about any of that because none of that is under your control. You don't control airplanes schedules. Mm-hmm. It's really not up to you. You don't control the weather. You don't control mechanical issues with the plane. Nothing. None of that. You don't control how the airline is going to deal with it, whether they're going to cancel the flight or just postpone it or replace the airplane or the crew. It's like none of that. It has nothing to do with it. So just don't even think about it. Don't go there. What you do instead is like, okay, you immediately ask yourself, well, what in this particular case is up to me? The first thing is up to you is to actually get immediately on one of the, on the airline's app and try to reschedule your flight. Because if you do it quick, you're going to beat other people and you're going to be likely to get on the next flight, much more likely to get on the next flight than not. Okay, once you have rebooked your flight, then the next thing you want to do that is up to you is to call whoever was depending on you to get on time. So if it was let's say a work-related issue, then call your contact at work and say, hey, I'm going to be delayed. I'm going to be there at this time. If it was a vacation, call the hotel and say, there is a delay. I'm going to be there at this time. And once you're done all of that, which is up to you, that is the kind of stuff that is up to you. Walk over to the nearby bar, open a book, order a drink, and relax. Because those, again, are things that you can do. Enjoy, the 2 or 3 hours of delay, whatever it is. Read a book, catch up with your email, do whatever it is that you want to do. Just don't even go with your mind toward the kinds of stuff that you cannot change because that's useless. Not only you cannot change it, you're going to feel worse because you realize you're going to be frustrated. So that's one example. Or let's say tomorrow morning I have a job interview. It comes natural for most of us to focus on the outcome. Again, I want the job, right? So I'm going to be worrying about, will I get the job? Will I not get the job? What happens if I get the job? What happens if if I don't get the job? Blah, blah, blah. And it will smack you in the face and say, no, that's not up to you. It depends on too many things that are not under your control. It depends on who the competition is for that job, which you don't know and you don't control. It depends on whether your qualifications actually meet the requirements of the job. There too, you don't really have a lot of control. It depends on who is doing the interview, right? And what they want and how they feel that morning. Maybe they had a fight with their husband or wife and they got to come to the interview and they're pissed off and they're going to do, everything they can to fail people. None of that is up to you. So don't go there with your mind. What is up to you? Well, to prepare for the interview as best as you can in the days before the interview itself, right? So do your homework. Good. That's up to you. Try to go to bed at a reasonable time because a good night's sleep will be helpful for your interview. Try to get on time to the interview itself the following morning because that's good form. You're going to piss off people immediately if you're late for the interview, right? And you don't want that. Now, notice that I said that these last two things, I said, try to get a good night's sleep and try to get to the job interview on time. Why did I say that? Because actually getting a night of sleep or actually getting on time, that's not up to you because it depends on other things, right? I can go to bed in an early time and decide that I really need to sleep. And then my neighbor is going to have a party until 1 o'clock in the morning and I can't sleep. I can decide to go get out of my apartment on time and get on a taxi or on the subway. But there could be traffic. There could be delays in the subway. And those are not up to me. So by doing this about everything, literally everything you need to do, I developed this habit where in my mind I have this spreadsheet with 2 columns, up to me, not up to me. Mm-hmm. And I tried slowly over the years to train myself to not only mentally, and sometimes actually in writing, if I have the time, I actually put it down in writing. not only make as detailed lists as possible about what about this particular situation is or is not up to me, but I also keep trying to nudge my mind toward the things that are up to me and away from the things that are up to me. The result of this practice is A, you're much more calm. You're much more, you get upset much less, you get angry much less. I mean, nobody's perfect. So occasionally, you slip up and you get upset about things that you shouldn't be getting upset. But, welcome to the world of human beings. They're not perfect. And you become much more efficient because you're not wasting a lot of time and energy and emotional energy, especially on the things that are not up to you. You're focusing that time and energy and resources on the things that are up to you. And therefore, you're going to make much more progress. And, you're going to get a lot more stuff done. So that's just one example of a really important Stoic technique. As I said, so important that Epictetus calls it the fundamental rule. That really has made a difference in my life.
That's beautiful. I think that's the best place to end it, Massimo. This was a great conversation. I think talking about the secret to being happy and also not talking about it from modernity, but the ancient world, I think is very important because if things have value and substance, they're the only ones that survive for this long.
That's
So
right.
with that, where can we find you online?
I have a single site where there is almost everything that I do. It's over there. It's called massimopigliucci.org. So it's my first name and last name .org. Or I have a Substack newsletter which is called The Philosophy Garden.
That's beautiful. Well, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you. It was a pleasure being here.